Good evening. I'm Gwen Bird, Dean of Libraries at Simon Fraser University. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. It's a privilege to be gathered here on this territory tonight. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome you this evening for the first SFU Dean of Libraries lecture on information and society. This new annual lecture is made possible through a generous gift to the university from the Takor Charitable Foundation, and we are delighted to have several members of the Takor family and friends here with us tonight. Their financial gift to SFU allowed us to initiate and sustain this lecture series. The goal of the series is to broadly showcase the contributions of libraries and archives to the intellectual life of the university and the wider community. When we discussed this idea with the family, it was my hope to establish a series that would consider the role of libraries and archives in sparking creativity, in fueling scholarship and art, and in acting as a catalyst for a more just society. And I could not be more pleased with our program this evening to inaugurate the series. I have some housekeeping items to mention. Tonight's event is being filmed and photographed. If you don't wish to have your photo taken, please see one of our staff members and they will assist you. All gender bathrooms are available on this floor in that direction, and a reminder to please turn off your cell phones before we begin. Now let me describe how this evening will proceed. In a moment, I'll introduce Chantal Gibson, and then she will introduce Lawrence Hill. We'll have the program for about an hour, consisting of readings and conversation between Chantal and Lawrence. Following the program, there will be books for sale in the lobby, thanks to our friends from Pulp Fiction Books. Lawrence Hill will be available to sign books for those who are interested in the lobby. Note that we will not be having a Q&A session at the end of the program, so please just relax and enjoy and know that you don't have to formulate questions and try to remember them. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Chantal Gibson. Chantal is an artist, educator living in Vancouver with roots in Nova Scotia. Her visual and written works are driven by her interest in the cultural production of knowledge. From her historical interventions, a series of altered Canadian history books, to Souvenir, a large-scale installation recently displayed at the ROM in Toronto and currently en route to the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal, her works explore how we read and write history, often challenging representations of Blackness and otherness in the Canadian landscape. Chantal teaches writing and design communication in the School of Interactive Arts and Technology at Simon Fraser University. She received the SFU Excellence in Teaching Award in 2016. She is currently working on her first book of creative writing, an autobiocritical exploration of Black women in Canadian art and literature. Chantal.
Good evening, everyone. Okay, there's no fourth wall. Good evening, everyone. All right. Thank you. And thank you, Gwen. So welcome to SFU's inaugural 2018 Dean's Lecture on Information and Society. Let me just get this going here. Okay. So first of all, I want to clarify that this is not a lecture. It's a conversation. And I have been lucky enough to been corresponding with my new BFF for about 3 months. And in our correspondence via email and a few phone chats, was able to kind of see some common interests that we had and to look at how his work shows up in society. And so the two themes that I came up with were correspondence and interaction, and those will be evident across the evening. So first I want to start off by saying in November, I received a text message from Baharak Yousefi, who is on keyboard for us tonight, and she is the head of library communications at SFU. So the first interaction that I had regarding this event was this text message. Hello, do you know Lawrence Hill personally? I'm investigating a possible opportunity to invite him to SFU and would love for you to interview him. Anyway, not sure if his dates work with ours, but would love to chat and scheme if you're willing. Yes, that's it. Then I got this. One more question. Before a proper catch-up, would you be in, and then that's a typo, it says touch, but would you be available at the end of April for this? Would be either the 27th or 26th. I'm sending in the proposal today and just wanted to check, read dates, thank you. Yes, I will make myself available, planning to travel in May and June. Unnecessary information. And then Roger, stay tuned. And so I got Kat with love eyes and prayer hands. So fortunately, it all worked out, but we realized that we have to really work on our emoji game because we were way more excited than our emojis. So when this event was confirmed, Baharak and I met, and she said, you guys can do whatever you want as long as the theme is information in society, which is pretty big. And so if you go to Lawrence Hill's amazing website, everything there is to know about him is on that website. So First Stop Information Society, Lawrence Hill's site. So if you scroll down the author's page, you'll see Any Known Blood, the Book of Negroes, the Illegal, the Massey Lectures, the Honorary Doctorates, the Governor General's Award, the Commonwealth Prize for Literature, the Order of Canada, a star on Canada's Walk of Fame, and my favorite, 2 CBC Canada Read Victories. So I thought, well, first of all, I was like, holy crackers, like what's left for me to talk about? And so I thought maybe we could have an event that helps us get to know our guest beyond the resume and to see other ways that he has an effect on society. So now I'm going to tell you a personal story. So this is a piece that I created in 2010. It's called a Bookmark. It is a mixed media installation made of jute rope and painted fabric. And the next one is a close-up. The work is comprised of 3,000 bookmarks, individually cut and sewn together. It is a hanging book that commemorates the Black Loyalists crossing to Nova Scotia. Guess what? The work was inspired by the work of Lawrence Hill. I know, right? This, for me, is the impact of the Book of Negroes. So here's the story. In 2008, I was in St. Louis, Missouri for a writing fellowship. One of the faculty members, Nellie Rosario, said, have you read the new Lawrence Hill? I said, no, I haven't. She just said, get on it. 2009, I read the book, and that is the same time that I started my critical art practice. And that led me to the historical document, the original historical Book of Negroes. In 2010, the work went to the ROM, and then it went to Montreal. It's back in Vancouver. It went to Michigan and a show in Ohio. In 2011, I took a study leave, and I got a scholarship to the University of Michigan Art and Design program. And guess which work was the centerpiece of my portfolio? So with that said, I would like you to see this. When it was in the ROM, I emailed Lawrence Hill and I told him all about my work and how excited I was that he had inspired my work and how much I loved the book. And he wrote me back. And what was amazing about his response was so incredibly generous. And he says, tell me more about your work as an artist, if you don't mind. Seriously. So I sent him some pictures, and then, next slide, he sent me a note from the airport, because the first photos I'd sent weren't very clear. And he's like, thank you for resending. I got the photos. And then proceeded to say, the next time it's available for public viewing, please let me know, because he was in Sechelt. He said, please let me know. And then he said, I will be in Nova Scotia at Dalhousie Reads. And it would be lovely if we could get the work there. So he actually tried to help me get the book in the Dalhousie Gallery during Dalhousie Reads. It was already booked, but this was the kind of generosity that was shown to me. And then ended with questions about my life, my family, because I had talked to him about my interest in the Loyalists. So I owe much to that work. And I think about if my life has been impacted this much, all the people that he's touched, I wonder how many other people have been impacted by his work. So I just want to say, I thought about this on the way. You know how famous people, or heroes, they always say, if I could just touch one life, if I could just change one person's life, I'd be good. You're good. You're good. So tonight, Lawrence Hill is going to spend some time with us in a conversation, and he's going to read from some of his earlier works, lesser-known works, that emerged through our conversation. So it is really my honor to welcome, and please join me in welcoming our guest, Lawrence Hill.
Thank you so much, Chantal. Can you hear me okay at the back? Okay, I'll just move this to the side. Still hear me? Great. No? Oh. I thought you were coming off this mic. Can you hear me now at the back? Yes. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much to SFU for inviting me. I really, really appreciate the invitation. It's the first chance I've actually had to speak to people at SFU. So thank you to Dean Gwen Bird, and a huge thank you to Baharak Yousefi, who's organized this event and went back and forth with me many times to set it up and was wonderful to work with. And thank you so much to my fellow artist and co-conspirator, Chantal Gibson, for inventing a whole new way of talking this evening, which I hope you'll enjoy. And by the way, Chantal, just to add to another moment of coincidence, you mentioned that you'd been in St. Louis, Missouri. My father was born in Independence, Missouri, and he stayed there for 3 years or so till the family moved out to Colorado, but he was born in Missouri, so there's another connection. So I mentioned my father because we're going to talk a little bit about him and my relationship with him this evening and how that affected my development as a writer. And my father was a complex man. I loved him very much. I miss him very much. He died 15 years ago, an African-American born in 1923 in Independence, Missouri. Spent his life as a human rights activist. He created the Ontario Human Rights Commission. He was its first director and then chairperson. He later became the Ombudsman of Ontario. He created the Ontario Black History Society and spent his whole life with my mother, who's still alive, Donna Hill, a white woman, spent his life at the forefront of Canada's human rights movement. And he was, on one hand, a very charismatic person, adored by hundreds, if not thousands of people, especially in Ontario where he lived. On the other hand, he was a very difficult parent when I was a child, and that will become apparent as you hear these. And one of my father's issues was that, as an African American, he wanted us, his children, my brother Dan Hill, my late sister Karen Hill, and me, to become professionals so that we could be protected from the social and racial turbulence that he'd faced as a young black man growing up in America and fighting for the American forces as a segregated soldier in World War II. So, to launch us in our lives of professionals, he made me in particular write letters for the things we wanted. And I wanted to have a cat, and he said, no, can't have a cat. He was an inveterate pet hater. And I asked the second time, and he said no, and I asked the third time, and he said, if you really want that cat, go up to your room and write me a letter, and tell me in the letter why you deserve to have the cat, how your allowance will pay for its cat food, and how you'll prevent it from having babies in the closet. And if you can write me a well-rendered letter with no spelling mistakes, I'll give your request due consideration. Quintessential bureaucrat, Ontario Human Rights Commission, due consideration. So I wrote this letter, and I just poured my heart and soul into this letter, and I'm going to share it with you and a couple others. So, Baharak, I'm going to begin with kitten letter number 1. Actually, there's another one which I couldn't find, so there are a few, but you're going to hear a few of them right now. Dear Dad, and by the way, I'm about 6 or 7 in this letter writing phase, 6 or 7 years old. Dear Dad, all my life you've been very kind to me, but I just wanted to ask you a few things. May I have a kitten? May it be mine? I have a good reason for it to be mine. My reason is that when I called for Malcolm, he was over at another friend's house of mine. This was Jim's house. Jim has a cat. And Jim's cat had 3 babies, B-A-B-Y-S. One of them is a very darling little one. Jim told me all about his cat. He said she was 2 months old. She's trained to go to the washroom. She has very good behavior. I think it should be mine because I was the one who found out about the kittens. I'm sure you would like her. I have $1 I will give you to help pay for food you will buy for her. The kitten is free. Love, Larry. That was kitten letter number 1. Now I'm going to read kitten letter number 2. Dear Dad, will you please get another kitten? Can it be mine? I'm willing to pay money for it. I will get up early and feed her. I'll clean her litter box, and I promise you this, I will take good care of her. Turn page. Please, 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 please don't let anybody see this letter. Thank you. Sincerely yours, Larry. I have to tell you that there is no better way to become a writer than to have the world's greatest literary critic sitting downstairs at the kitchen table with his arms crossed. Impress me. You better impress me. I wasn't learning to write for some arid imposition in school. I wanted something, and I was writing to get it. And it was a great way to put, to direct my passion into argument to get the things I wanted. And it drove me over and over again to the page. So here we are with kitten letter number 3. Dear Dad, I'm back to talk to you again about Smokey. As you see, I got the cat. You see, Smokey really is a good cat. It's just that you don't understand Smokey, and she doesn't understand you. As you know, or you don't know, cats are supposed to be petted, comforted, and played with all day. But at night, they're supposed to have the wild part of their life. But you say at night, all she does is sleep in Karen's baby carriage. Karen was my younger sister. But now if we pet and comfort her at day, maybe she won't sleep in Karen's baby carriage at night. Maybe she'll have the wild part of her life. If she has an accident, I'll clean it up. Anyway, I'm absolutely positive that she knows better than to do without any furniture. Smokey is a good cat, and I can prove it. I'm coming to the point that Smokey should be kept inside, not in the whole day, just the part you are away. You see, you frightened Smokey, and you have ever since she came into this house. Things like jumping out of the hall in front of her scared her. And what really scared her was when you picked her up by the hair of her neck and threw her outside. Then she realized you were boss. Now she pays respect to you. And about when you put the cat bowl behind your chair, I suggest that you put the bowl in the regular spot the first time, then every day put it a little closer until behind your chair. This is outside, of course. Please consider all this deeply. Larry. And, sometimes I really wonder about this because he was a very intimidating father who was prone to, I hate to say, but it's true, he was prone to very violent outbursts and directed toward me or my brother. And it was risky to write him these letters, to challenge him. I was taking a risk of, really facing some serious repercussions that you don't want to hear about. So here's another one. I think this one, this is kind of interesting. I think this one must have been written before the one you just heard. So I'm sorry for the back and forth. This is kitten letter number 4 anyway. Dear Dad, once again I'm asking if you will get a kitten and it can be mine. Karen was just a big copycat to write a letter asking if it could be hers. So I didn't even sign that one. And finally, oh, this is interesting. This is the last one. And actually, I think this is kitten letter number 5, but I think it was written earlier in the sequence. I was, in this one, I think I'm about 6, because I spelled Humane Society, UMAINSUSIEDY. That was my spelling for Humane Society. Anyway, this was kitten letter number 5, and this is the last one I'll read to you. You know, he sure backfired, because if he'd wanted me to become a doctor, he shouldn't have made me write all these letters. He made me become a novelist then and there with all these letters. Because once I started, I didn't stop, and I wrote letters for everything I wanted after this, everything. Dear Dad, I think I know what you think about Cindy, and you're right. You know Cindy doesn't mean to hurt. Will you let her have a few more chances? If you do, we can try as hard as we can to train her. Thanks a lot. The reasons I don't want Cindy to go to the Humane Society. 1, she'll be locked up in a cage. 2, she won't have anything to do except sit, rest, eat, and of course, meow. Please do not let Karen and Danny read this note. Thank you. Sincerely yours, Larry. So, yeah, those were my first bursts of writing. And after that, my first pair of Adidas Rom running shoes, permission to stay out after the street lights came on, first pair of Levi blue jeans. I wrote letters for them, and that's how I learned to get the things I wanted. Thank you so much.
So first of all, I'm wondering, based on the letters, how many of you would have given young Larry a cat? Yeah. I don't have kids, so I would give you like 10 kittens if you wanted. So what we're going to do now is take a look at the Book of Negroes and a little bit at the illegal, and then end with some other works that Larry has done that are not related to fiction. But I wanted to start with talking about the Book of Negroes. So this segment I have titled, What's in a Name? So first of all, the Book of Negroes came out in 2007. And then the CBC miniseries, which was also on BET, Black Entertainment Television, was in 2015. How many of you have read the book? Yeah. And how many of you saw the miniseries? Terrific. Okay, great. So what's in a name? So what I wanted to do here, Larry was really generous in sharing some archival documents that are currently at the University of Toronto. So we'll go to the next slide. So my question to you, I was snooping through. So this is the proposal. This is the first proposal. Yeah. And when did you actually write this? Because it says proposal date of delivery October 1st, 2000. When did you write this?
I probably wrote that in, well, it was after Any Known Blood, which was published in 1997. I probably wrote that in 1997.
1997? Okay, so
maybe 1998.
Maybe, okay. So for those folks that are new to the work, I was wondering if you could just give a brief summary of the novel before we take a look at some of the images.
Sure. Well, Any Known Blood is the Book of Negroes we're talking about, is a novel told in the voice of an African woman who's enslaved as a child in her village in rural West Africa and brought into bondage in the Americas. She's brought to the province of South Carolina. It's still a British province, where she works on an indigo plantation, and then she is sold to another slave owner, a Jewish man who lives in Charleston, and she works enslaved for him for some time. She's a skilled midwife. She's been a skilled midwife since she was about 10 years old. And when she's abducted, of course, to step back in West Africa, she sees her parents murdered, and she has to walk naked to the sea for 3 months before she's sent across the ocean. And so she's had a very traumatic childhood, but she's already a skilled midwife. before she's abducted. She's always already very good with her hands by 10 or 11. And she's just starting to menstruate at the time that she's stolen and sent away without clothes across the continent of Africa to where a slave vessel will pick her up. And then she moves through her first years enslaved in the Americas. Then she escapes her owner in New York City. And she serves the British during the American Revolutionary War. And then the British send her and 3,000 other peoples of African descent who served the British in the war. They reward them for service, wartime service, by shipping them off to Nova Scotia after the American Revolutionary War ends and the rebels win it and go on to create the United States of America. And then she's so oppressed, as are other African peoples in Nova Scotia, with just horrid treatment that they faced in Nova Scotia, that they voluntarily choose to leave and to sail to Africa to found the colony of Freetown in 1992. And then she goes in her old age to fight for the abolition of the British slave trade in London, England. And so the Book of Negroes is a slave narrative. It's a novel masquerading as a slave narrative. And a slave narrative, of course, is the first kind of fiction. The first kind of book. It's nonfiction. The first kind of book that black peoples in the Americas are publishing and getting known for is the slave narrative. They're all the same. This is my name. This is how I was born. This is how I lost my parents. This is how I became enslaved. This is how I fled my owner. This is how I came to write you this book, dear reader. So the slave narrative is the first form of black literature in the Americas. So I wrote this novel as if it were a memoir by a woman who'd escaped slavery, as if it were an autobiography. But of course it's not. It's a novel, but written in the voice of an 18th century African woman. Aminata Diallo, my protagonist. So it's a novel about this woman's life in and out of slavery, in and out of Africa, loving and suffering and living and refusing to lose her passion for life. It's a novel about a woman's resilience, really, in the 18th century.
So in the proposal, your protagonist's name is Sarah Jane Pooley. If we go to the next slide, this is the first page of the first draft of the Book of Negroes, 2003. And we have Anna Marie Peterson. And then over here we have, back. And then in your final draft, we have Aminata Diallo, the famous Mina D, and you even show us like Aminata, how to say it. So I'm just wondering if you will tell us the story of how she got her name, that process.
And just to be clear, in case it's confusing to you, this first page here was written in 2003, so it's the first page of the first draft of the novel. And what you're seeing on the right is the final published version. So these are not from the same draft. The right-hand page is the final page of a published book. The left-hand page is the first page of the first draft. And there were about 10 drafts of the novel before it was done. 10 serious drafts and others in between those serious ones. So I didn't know what to call her. At first I thought I'd call her Sarah Jane Pooley. Then I was thinking about Anna Marie Peterson. And finally I came up with Aminata Diallo. I didn't even realize at first I was going to write it as if it were a slave narrative in the first person. All slave narratives are written in the first person, but I began my first draft playing around, just looking for the voice, and I began the first draft in the third person. And also I began the first draft much more bluntly, just going straight into the hell of her life. And I finally figured out that wasn't the way to start the book. That's not the way I wanted to start the book. I didn't have to dive into hell in the first paragraph or two of the story. That could wait for a few pages, and I could sort of orient her in a different way, giving her dignity and her solidity as an old woman. Also, I really hadn't figured out that I'd start the book in her old age and then go back to her childhood and then move it forward chronologically, occasionally slipping back to her old age to liven the narrative, to change the voice up. So occasionally give her the voice of an old woman, but otherwise to follow her chronologically. So I had a lot to figure out. So basically, I didn't know what the hell I was doing in the first draft. And that's how it always is for me. I have no idea what I'm doing, and I write to figure it out. Some people might figure out their books by sitting at the kitchen table, scratching their chins. That's not how I work. I work by writing a messy, uninformed, kind of a confused first draft. And it's a first draft that helps me figure out what I really want to do. So that's my process to understand my story, rather than writing some blueprint at the kitchen table. That never works for me. I never get anything good that way. So I have to struggle through a confused draft or two before I begin to really understand what I really want to do. So that's what you see here in the difference between these two sections. I don't know if that's legible from where you're sitting, but they're markedly different forms of writing, literary approaches, and they're not even written in the same person. The final is in the first person, and the first approach was in the third person. So I didn't even know it was going to be a slave narrative yet.
So Aminata becomes...
Oh, I'm sorry, you asked how she became named.
Yeah.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. Aminata is the middle name of my eldest child, Genevieve Aminata. And Aminata, for anybody in this audience who's been in West Africa, and I've spent some formative periods of my life working as a volunteer in various West African countries, Mali, Niger, Cameroon, other countries I've lived in. Aminata is as common a name as Mary or Joanne in Canada. It's a very common Muslim name. It's a beautiful name. I think it means a peaceful one. And Aminata was the name of a midwife I met in Mali who was catching babies all by herself with nothing. There was no running water or electricity or roads or schools or doctors. She was just catching babies by herself in this brick home. And her name was Aminata, and so I named my eldest daughter after her. And so that's why I finally named her Aminata, to ask myself every day as I wrote, what if this were my daughter? How would she get through this journey? How would my daughter have survived this harrowing nightmare and kept her love of life intact? So I decided to name her Aminata to feel her more deeply on the page.
You put the pen in her hand, and she writes the historical Book of Negroes. So this is an image that of one page of the historical Book of Negroes, and of course comes back to a list of names. And I'm wondering what it took for you to put the pen in her hand. One, how you used this document, but how Aminata actually writes that document in the text.
Sure, thank you. Well, again, apologies, but for those of you who don't know, I'll just explain what the Book of Negroes is. The Book of Negroes, in addition to the title, is a British ledger kept by the British Navy in 1783 to document the exodus of 3,000 African Americans from Manhattan to, well, a few were going to Germany, one or two went to the UK, a couple went to Quebec City, and one or two went to the Caribbean, but 95% of the black loyalists fleeing Manhattan at the end of the American Revolutionary War are going to Nova Scotia. And again, just to contextualize that, African peoples have been in Canada since 1603, but the first documented slave in Canada was in 1608. Olivier Lejeune, an 8-year-old boy who was a slave of a Catholic priest in Quebec City. But the first big wave of black peoples into Canada is with the black loyalists who are coming in a number of 3,000 from New York City to Nova Scotia in 1783. And so the British had to document all these African Americans that they're taking out of Manhattan, infuriating George Washington as they do it. So they enter their names into this ledger. And it contains 3,000 names, and the pieces of paper in the ledger are sort of the size of that lectern. And there's 9 columns of biographical information, up to 9 columns. This is just a piece of one page. That's not even a full page. So there's up to 9 columns of information about each person who's named in the book. And it's the first time in history, the first time in North American history, Canadian or American, that thousands of black people are publicly documented by a formal body, this body being the British Navy. And so Aminata and the other black loyalists have to be registered in the Book of Negroes before they're allowed to sail from New York to Nova Scotia. And you can't just get registered if you want to. You have to prove that you served the British for at least a year in Manhattan during the war, whether you were a soldier, a spy, a cook, a prostitute, a midwife. You have to prove that you served the British, which men and women did, in exchange for a written promise that they'd be given their freedom after the war. So that's what the Book of Negroes is, and I named the novel after that. And I mean, some historical novelists feel that they need to get every fact right, and I don't work quite that way. I profoundly want to respect and say in this book the major historical undercurrents of, say, the story of slavery, or say the story of the black loyalists. So I didn't knowingly change anything serious relating to my understanding of the transatlantic slave trade or the black loyalists. But I'm happy to switch all sorts of details to improve the novel, all sorts of minor details. No black woman helped write the Book of Negroes. I know who wrote the Book of Negroes, the document. It was written by assistant deputy quartermasters of the British Navy, and they're named in the Book of Negroes. But I chose to have Aminata be a scribe, a paid scribe by the British Navy, taking down the names of her fellow brethren and sisters. I chose to have her write it because it made for a better story. And I was happy to change that fact. And I acknowledged it, at the end of the book, that I played with that fact. So that's why I had to do that, because it just jazzed up the story and made it so much more interesting. And it put her in the middle of this exodus. So I don't mind playing with little bits of history if it serves a novel, but I wouldn't knowingly pervert something that was serious in a novel that attempts to be authentic. In another kind of novel, I wouldn't worry about that. But in this novel, as I was trying to replicate my true understanding of how things really were, I wouldn't have intentionally got a major historical fact wrong.
And I think if we go to the next slide, your desire to be authentic and to actually use the name of the historical document was not well received by your American publishers. And so can you talk a little bit about the name of the book and how the journey of that name?
It was going to be published as the Book of Negroes in the States. And the U.S. publisher, they've been wonderful to me, Norton, W.W. Norton. Those of you who've been to high school or universities in Canada probably had to read the Norton anthologies. So Norton is my publisher in the United States. And they've, to be fair, they've treated me really well and worked hard to support my career in the States. However, although they had agreed to publish it as the Book of Negroes, in the market, the way it worked and kind of still works is that in America, if they're trying to figure out, how many books to print in the first run, they obviously poll the bookstores and find out what Barnes & Noble or what this bookstore or that bookstore's order is going to be. And then based on the orders, the advance orders that they get, they decide how many books to print in the first run. Well, they weren't getting any orders because the bookstores refused to order it with the word Negroes in the title. And so while I was on book tour in Germany with my second youngest daughter, Evangeline, she was 9 or 10 at the time, we were up in the Baltic Sea in the former East Germany, and I get this email from my editor saying, oh, well, we're going to print on Monday. This was Friday. And by the way, we're changing the title. And it's no longer going to be the Book of Negroes. And I just spent all weekend fighting to try to at least get a title that was palatable to me, since they had jettisoned the Book of Negroes. And so it became, on my suggestion, Someone Knows My Name, which some readers have likened to weakened rum, watered down rum, in comparison to the Book of Negroes. But anyway, I was required to change the title. And before we get too judgmental about that, living in Vancouver, or as I do in Hamilton, Ontario, you should live in South Chicago or Atlanta or Brooklyn before you jump to a conclusion too fast about how inappropriate that decision was. You know, if you use that word in an ill-considered way in South Chicago, you'll get your nose broken or worse. It's a much more inflammatory word in urban America than it is in, say, West Van. And so it's hard for Canadians to appreciate that the word has a different resonance in Black America than it does here. Certainly it did 10 years ago. I think that's changed a bit in the last 5 years. So the title had to change to suit the whims of my publisher and the bookstores. It was a bummer.
Well, it caused some problems in the Netherlands as well.
Yeah, well, that title didn't cause any problems, but I'll read. I'll read one other letter or two that have nothing to do with kittens. I promise. So, I got the strangest letter of my life after the book was published in the Netherlands, and there's two markets in the world that have been most generous to me outside Canada, in the places where my books have sold the most and been the best bestsellers have been Norway and the Netherlands, and so outside of North America, and they've been great publishers, and I've had wonderful experiences touring in those countries and meeting people. And I went on this tour in the Netherlands, and it was great. And I was also very connected to the Black community in the Netherlands and very welcomed by them. However, I did get this letter, and I'm just going to read it to you, and then my reply, which formed the basis of this little book I wrote called Dear Sir, I Intend to Burn Your Book. So here we go. In June of 2011, less than a month after launching the Dutch edition of my novel, The Book of Negroes, in the Netherlands, I received the most surprising email of my life. It's worth quoting verbatim. Dear Sir Lawrence Hill, we, descendants of the enslaved in the former Dutch colony Suriname, want to let you know that we do not accept a book with the title The Book of Negroes. We struggle for a long time to let the word nigger disappear from Dutch language, and now you set up your Book of Negroes. A real shame. That's why we make the decision to burn this book on the 22nd of June, 2011. Maybe you do not know, but June is the month just before the 1st of July, the day that we remember the abolition from the Dutch, who put our ancestors in slavery. Sincerely, Roy Groenberg. Attached to the email was a handwritten poster saying in Dutch, summons to Afro-Surinamese Dutch people to come to book burning in Oster Park near the monument. I wrote a reply that, in retrospect, seems outrageously Canadian in its politeness and tact. Here's what I said. Dear Mr. Groenberg, I'm very sorry to hear of your plans to burn my book. Are you aware of the historical origins of the title? It's a historical novel. The Book of Negroes is the name of a British military ledger that documents the exodus of 3,000 African Americans from New York City to Nova Scotia at the end of the American Revolutionary War. It's a very important genealogical document as it provides a great deal of biographical information about the blacks who migrated from the USA to Canada in 1783. The original copy of this document is kept in the National Archives in the UK. The document is central to my novel. My main character must have her name entered into the Book of Negroes before she, like 3,000 other blacks fleeing American slavery, is allowed to sail to Canada. The use of the title, The Book of Negroes, or Het Negerboek in Dutch, has offered me the opportunity to explain this history, which is fascinating, important, and troubling to many thousands of readers in Canada, the UK, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. I found that when given the opportunity to see what I'm doing in this book and with this title, readers understand that the title is not intended to be offensive, but it is used historically to shed light on a forgotten document and on a forgotten migration that thousands of blacks from the USA to Canada. Did you know that I gave a talk recently about this book, its historical origins, and the title to the Surinamese group Ninsay in Amsterdam last month? Before you proceed with your plans to burn my novel, would you like to have a conversation about this? Thank you, Lawrence Hill. Another letter. Huh? Another letter.
Another letter, yeah. So that's the theme. So here's what I wanted to do, just as a bit of a detour. So I wanted to look at how other people might be talking about this controversy. So I was snooping around online. And this is Jason Purcell, who did you? Yeah, so you're over there, but you got cut off. You're like right there, interview with
University
Lawrence
of
Hill.
Alberta. Yeah, he's a great guy.
That's right. So this is a review. He did a review of the Book of Negroes, but he also talked about, Dear Sir, I intend to burn your book. And what he did was, to his viewers, he posed the question, should Lawrence Hill have changed the name of his book? So in this next segment, this is called What Would Larry Say? And what I did, I took 3 comments that I thought might speak to larger issues and questions that folks might have, and I thought, I'm going to ask you the question and see what your response would be. I can read it to you if you want to.
Is that person writing to me? The one on the top?
No, they're responding to Jason
I got it.
Purcell.
Okay,
but
thanks.
I just thought, the comment pages, it was like, I don't know, there was over 100 responses. And so I grabbed a few, and I thought I would ask you. So Mr. Asma Yusuf, okay, so that's the first one, says, first thing he says to Jason Purcell is, it's not your place as a white man to insert yourself into a discussion about its title. What do you think?
What do I think?
What would you say about that?
Well, I disagree. I don't believe that a person should tell another person they have no right to speak or think. I think that you need to be careful and pay attention and give other people who are involved in an issue plenty of room to engage themselves. But just to say that you have no right to speak about something because, in this case, you're white, is, in my opinion, misplaced. I mean, there's a long history of the suppression of black voices, and I'm very concerned about that. But I'm not among those who would argue that that means that a white person has no right to a voice or to an opinion or to participate in a conversation. So that's further along the line of argument than I would be prepared to go. And by the way, my mother's white, so I'm not quite sure where that would leave me. Maybe I'd only be able to speak half of the conversation. So that's my opinion, that it's too much to tell a person you have no right to have a thought or speak. I also think that one needs to be very careful to remember all the voices that have been crowded out in silence and deserve room to speak and to make every effort to give those voices a platform. So this is not to say that I think we've done things right in the past, but it also is to say that I don't think the solution is to tell a person they have no right to speak.
Okay. Halle Berry, 1980. I think that the changing of the name is almost cowardly. It is not an offensive word until people make it that way. And people are so completely wrapped up with needing to be politically correct these days that it is almost like they are trying to stifle history. Lawrence Hill was not using the word in an offensive way by any means. It is a document in history that exists. Why are we trying to pretend that it doesn't? So my question to you is are we being politically correct? What is the role of political correctness here?
Well, I have a feeling you feel the same way, but I hate the term politically correct. I find it an offensive term. And the reason I hate it is because, no, it really does bother me, because it suggests that it trivializes the sorts of concerns that people like me, might have about injustice in society. To call something politically correct is to trivialize the very nature of the concern that it raises. And usually it's raised by people who are trying to dismiss a concern that's coming from the margins of society. So I have a big problem with the term politically correct because I feel it's a trivializing approach to discussion. So that's the first part of my answer. Although I appreciate the observation, which I agree with, that I wasn't trying to be offensive in any way in writing the title as the Book of Negroes, I disagree that it was cowardly on the part of the Americans to do so, because, as I said, you should live in Atlanta or in South Chicago or Brooklyn before you say that. The fact that we have the same language, English, in both countries doesn't mean that words have the same meaning in both countries. And to try living in a black community in the States before you determine that that was a cowardly response. It wasn't a response that I liked. I didn't want to see the title change, but to call it cowardly, I think, is to dismiss how inflammatory that word is in African American culture. The word Negro, I mean, it's undergone so many evolutions, but ever since, Malcolm X began to challenge Martin Luther King, the word Negro, in American culture suggests inside black culture that you're a black person with no self-respect, no pride, no authenticity, who only exists to please the white man. So it's a very denigrating term inside black culture. It didn't used to be. It wasn't in 1950 or 1960, but by the time Malcolm X starts to inform and influence language in the United States and elsewhere, it moves into this new meaning. And so to deny how inflammatory that word is, how insulting it is, in many ways, it's much more insulting than the word nigger because of what it has black people saying to each other, about what they're not, how they're not authentic. So it's a hurtful word inside black culture. And so it's not cowardly, it's just, it was unfortunate. I didn't like it. But I think it's unfair to call it cowardly because I think it denotes a failure to understand the racial politics of the United States.
I think you need to cruise around your comment pages and just drop a comment in every once in a while. Rachel loves books. This was such an interesting review. It really made me think. I've only read one slavery book before, and that was years ago, and I don't tend to go towards the subject when I'm reading because I find it an uncomfortable topic. But maybe I should get out of my comfort zone, as people say. This book is going to be on my buying TBR list. So what do you say to people that are uncomfortable about the content?
Well, many people are uncomfortable. I've met people who are reading the book covertly, covering the cover page in the subways of Toronto because they didn't want somebody to see that they're walking around with a book called the Book of Negroes, because it made them uncomfortable to be associated with that title. But as for being uncomfortable as a reader, I mean, you can come to reading for all sorts of different reasons. You can read Winnie the Pooh, or A.A. Milne for the delight of verbal playfulness as a child and just enjoy the silliness and the absurdity of language, or you can read The Color Purple, and be astonished by violence, sexual violence inside a family and the abuse inside a family. There's all sorts of reasons to read, and sometimes reading is damn uncomfortable, and it's not always supposed to be comfortable. So believe me, I understand it's uncomfortable to read the Book of Negroes. It was uncomfortable for me to write it. But I don't feel that is a litmus test for evaluating the value of literature. Sometimes a book will make you uncomfortable. So, each reader will decide what they can tolerate and what they can't. I worked very hard to not beat up the reader in that book, and I really tried to find every literary strategy I could to make it possible for a reader to get through that book without suffering unduly. There was much less violence in the book that a woman would really have experienced in real life as an enslaved African woman in the time. I started the book in her old age to sort of place a reassuring hand on the reader, so the reader knows that no matter what hell is going to be visited upon this woman, she's going to survive to old age, because that's where the story starts. I had all sorts of devices, and she has this kind of friendly, rueful, playful, almost satirical sometimes tone. So she's a tough one, and she survived with her kind of playfulness intact in her old age, and so that was to sort of help the reader get through this book. So I really did work hard not to beat up on the reader, but it's an uncomfortable story. So it's going to be an uncomfortable read sometimes. I think the challenge is to let enough shafts of light into a tragedy so that it's readable. You know, a novel isn't reality. A novel is a representation of it, and there have to be enough shafts of light to give a reader hope. Otherwise, who's going to read if there's no hope? So a book isn't life. You know, a book is an enticement, you know, to step into something imaginary. So yes, it's uncomfortable, but I try not to make it unduly uncomfortable.
I had a similar experience. So the piece that you saw, Souvenir, is comprised of 2,000 blackened souvenir spoons. And so the way that the piece works is that you have 2,000 individual identities that have all been erased. And so it's calling to this like shared history of blackness and this idea of erasure in Canadian culture. And on opening night, a very lovely woman came and sat and talked with me. And she was in her 60s, a white woman, and she said, and the show is called Here We Are Here, Black Canadian Contemporary Art. It's the first of its kind in the country. And she said, I feel so uncomfortable. And she said, my parents didn't raise me this way. I feel so uncomfortable. And so I talked to her about it, and I said, you know what? I said, just let yourself feel uncomfortable for a while. I said, don't be so quick to get it off you. Because I said, sometimes, you know, some people go through the world feeling uncomfortable every single day. And maybe your discomfort right now in this art show is helping you have a little empathy towards somebody else. So I'm really one of those people that is just like, you know, when you feel it and it feels icky, just lean in a little bit more and allow yourself to just know what that feels like, because I think it really is a step towards empathizing with someone else.
Yeah, that's so true. People bring such different things to a reading, you know, or to experiencing a visual arts event. And sometimes you're more available than others to be disturbed too. You know, you're not always in the same mental space when you come to a work of art.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can't take something now, but you can take it in 6 months. That's happened to me many times. I tried to read Great Expectations and couldn't get into it. And then a couple years later, I read it and loved it. I was in a different headspace.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we're going to look at one more artifact in this segment. So I just want to talk a little bit about the reception of the miniseries. So this is an article for IndieWire, and it was a list of the critics' reviews of the Book of Negroes when it was playing on BET. And one of the things that the effect that the book had and Lawrence Hill's name had, a lot of people felt like it was really legitimizing the Black Entertainment TV channel, right? And it was the first series that they had that would actually be eligible for an Emmy. So what I did was I went to the comment pages, and I just want to take a couple of, just 2 moments. So here's an interaction between Chris Kay and Katie. And Chris Kay says, it seems too unrealistic. I mean, a picnic at night in the 2nd episode. And Katie comes in and says, I can believe it. I read in, I believe, Scenes of Subjection, that sometimes groups of enslaved Africans from different plantations would meet at opposite sides of riverbanks and sing to each other. This was, of course, very dangerous, but they did it anyway. They'd even had parties in secret. So a picnic I can actually believe, especially with enslaved people who were in love. So the reason that I chose this is because I loved that people were having this conversation that was outside of the book. It just became like something else. And there's no hating, there's no, and actually the fact that I can actually believe, especially with enslaved people who were in love, to see 2 people talking and humanizing the characters that they were talking about. So that was the first, so I wanted to end on a really positive note. So the next one, okay, I had to show you this. We're not reading it, but I just wanted to show you this. So it starts off with, I watched it from Canada, and I absolutely love the character of Aminata and Anjanou Ellis' portrayal of her. So what I did was, the writing teacher in me, I was so compelled just by the length of this piece and the commitment that I did what I would do as a little rhetorical analysis summary over here in the margins. So this is me. And so, Larry, I just want you, and of course, Larry teaches writing at Guelph University as a professor. So I wanted to share it because I liked the interaction of the first two, but no one responded to this. And maybe the fear of the amount of text, or they didn't make it through. But I just wanted to engage. So it starts with this. So Ella Mack starts off with, she appreciates the craft of Ingenue Ellis, and she loves Aminata's story. Not too crazy about the pacing, a bit rushed. Background cast felt that they were out of place, maybe looked like tourists. Not enough brought in about the United Empire loyalists. So, in purple, she adds a brief history of blacks in Southern Ontario, the Underground Railroad, and Harriet Tubman for her American audience. Then she talks about the equality. She doesn't really believe the equality between Aminata and the British commander. She feels like Aminata, if it was real, she would have been weaker and the commander would have been meaner. But then she adds a brief summary of the treatment of black and white women during that time period. Next slide. Oh yeah, she wasn't done. Then she offers a brief reflection on her feelings, feeling that maybe the film was a bit too inspired by, or the series was a bit too inspired by modern thinking, but then gives us a moment where she talks about the hotness of the actor Larique Bent. So I love that she started with the craft of the actress and the hotness of the actor. So overall, she gives Book of Negroes a 6.5 out of 10 compared to Roots. Then she forgot something, adds something else, a historical tidbit, and then concludes with this. There are many stories of African American Canadian heritage to be told. Canada is often forgotten in the North American slave narratives. So as we transition out of this section, what does it feel like to see people engaging your work in this way?
Well, it's fantastic. That's the whole point of art, is to get people talking and feeling and engaging beyond the work of art that they watched or looked at or touched or felt or read. Is to stimulate, human exchange and reflection. And so it's, even if people are saying things that I disagree with, it's an incredible compliment to the book or to the miniseries that they're debating and discussing and engaging. That's fantastic. As for the hotness of Larique Bent, who plays Chikura, I have to tell you, that man takes his shirt off at every opportunity. And when I met him on set in South Africa, he just whipped off his shirt in the cafeteria, and he said, "Look at these muscles. Look at my six-pack. It's not painted on like some actors. Mine is real." And he wanted me to admire his six-pack, and that was our first meeting. It was the first time I'd met Larique Bent. So, he obviously, I guess, has a certain degree of hotness, and so it was kind of funny.
And it was fun. It was fun here. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So we're going to just talk a little bit about, so I'm calling this section Right Time, Right Place, so the illegal. So for those folks that are new to that work, if you could just give us a brief overview before I ask you a few questions.
I just want to see something. I'm just curious. All right, does that say Israel in the top left-hand corner? Yes, it does. That's interesting. I just wanted to see which version of the map they had. Well, The Illegal is a novel, came out in 2015. It's my 10th book, and it's a novel in two made-up countries, Zantoroland, which is a black nation in a fictional island in the Indian Ocean. The island is Zantoroland, just right here. And then the other made-up country is Freedom State, which is a large island to the north of Zantoroland, which is made up primarily of British migrants, but it's got a large black underclass of people who are living without documentation and a shanty town, a little bit like the townships of South Africa. And it's about a marathon runner who's hoping to make the Olympics in Zantoroland. Zantoroland is a country in the world that is extremely poor, but it produces the world's fastest marathoners. And he's hoping to be among the best in the world's fastest marathoning nation. But his country erupts in genocide, targeting his ethnic group, and so he has to flee, and he has to move into Freedom State, which is a very rich white democracy, a very powerful nation, the fourth richest nation in the world. He's got to move into Freedom State as an undocumented refugee, hiding. And the book follows really his first 3 months in hiding in Zantoroland, and his only means of survival, since he's living illegally in a country that will catch and deport him if it can, and if he's deported, he'll be killed. So his only means of making money is to enter the odd road race, 5K, 10K, half marathon, marathon. And if he can win that road race, then that's a few $1,000s for him to live off for several months. So that's his only means of scooping up any cash to stay alive. And so the novel follows his first 3 months living and hiding in a country that does not want him. And so that's what The Illegal's about.
Okay, so we're going to go to the next slide. And so I would just like to transition from Aminata, who is a very, very strong character. This is my favorite quote in the entire novel. The last thing Viola did before traveling to the airport was to use a paint scraper and olive oil to remove the I Dig Dykes on Wheels bumper sticker from her wheelchair. Every bit had to disappear before she showed up in Zantoroland. So I would like you to tell us about Viola, who describes herself as blagabled. Blagabled. So tell us about that word and tell us about this character. I call her intersectional Viola.
Well, blagabled is her word for, her made-up word for black, gay, and disabled, blagabled. And she just calls herself that playfully, I must insist. Viola Hill is a kick-ass journalist who's really pissed because she can't get on the news pages of her newspaper. She's consigned to the sports pages, and she wants off, and she wants to make it onto the news pages. She's very ambitious. She's hard-driven. She comes from a very poor background. She had a terrible accident when she was a child, and her legs were amputated. She's a wheelchair athlete. I interviewed an Olympic world wheelchair athlete, and the guy who won the Boston Marathon in the wheelchair category, to just see how adept a wheelchair athlete could be in a wheelchair. And I watched this guy just flip himself out of his chair and into his car, and flip the wheelchair into his car and drive off. And Viola Hill is a recreational wheelchair athlete and a sports journalist who's gay, and she is trying to make it in the world. And she comes upon the story of Keita Ali, my protagonist, and that's going to be her ticket, she hopes, to more fame and to proving herself as a real news journalist. I had to struggle with my editor about Viola Hill. My editor told me several times that she didn't like the idea that I'd be depicting a woman who was black, gay, and disabled, and that people would be offended by that, and I just didn't buy it. I feel that I respect her on the page. She's one of my favorite creations. I really like her. I like her energy. I don't feel that in any way I'm laughing at or mocking or making fun of her. I make fun of the world around her that doesn't know what to do with her, but I don't make fun of her. I feel I treat her with all the dignity she deserves. At least that's my impression. So I'm actually proud of that creation. I quite like that character. But she's going to research the story in Zantoroland, and sadly, Zantoroland, this black nation, has a major hate-on for people who are gay, and they'll be killed. And we've seen this unfortunately in other parts of the world, such as Uganda. We've seen homophobia at a terribly distressing level in other countries. Not that it doesn't exist here too, but in some countries you can be killed for being outed or for being gay. And so when Viola is going to Zantoroland, she has to disguise the fact that she's gay so that she isn't killed when she goes to research this story. So that's why she's scraping the I Dig Dykes on Wheels bumper off her wheelchair.
And I've never seen a character like this before. And one of the things that I appreciated, and those of you that read The Illegal, is that she is no wallflower. Like, she gets the crap kicked out of her. There's one scene where she gets thrown out of her chair, and she's really fighting for her life. And even her journey once she's in Zantoro land and dependent on a cab driver to assist her. So I feel there's something about her that I feel is really special, because she is this intersectional character, and she's empowered, and at the same time, you are not delicate with her.
I really, really like her. I really wanted her to be alive and, kind of a badass woman, in the best sense of the word. I wanted her to have energy, drive, personality. She takes shit from nobody. She's a driven woman, and she comes from poverty, and she's not going back. She is not going back to the poverty that she escaped from as a child. And so she's got that drive that we see some people exhibiting in that kind of situations. I'm really quite fond of her.
Okay, so my next character, just because we are in the presence of so many librarians, so this is Ivernia, and she says, I'm a widow, 85 years old, born and raised in Freedom State. She went on to say that she didn't understand why these people had to be referred to as illegals. To identify a human being as illegal is to diminish his or her humanity, she said. Why don't we call them people without documentation? And then she says, so they can't really come in any legal way then, Ivernia said. For now, no. Mr. Minister, Ivernia said, some of your so-called economic migrants are in great danger. When you are deporting people you deem to be illegal, you might be sentencing them to death. So can you just tell us a bit? She is a badass 81-year-old.
85,
Oh, she 85? Oh, yeah, sorry, 85. So just tell us a little bit about what she does.
Well, Ivernia Beach is the first time I've ever actually created a character who who strongly resembles the personality of my mother. My father kept cropping up inside other characters in my earlier books, but this is the first time my mother makes a grand entrance on stage. And, she's a civil rights activist. She's also disenchanted by life. She's having terrible problems with her son, among other things. Thankfully, I don't think that's the case with my mother, but it is here. Her son's giving her a really rough time, and she's in danger of losing her autonomy as an old woman. Ivernia Beach has a lot of problems, and she meets Keita Ali, who's, in his 20s, she's in her 80s, and they both kind of fall into some kind of platonic love. They really form this incredible bond, this old woman and this young man, and they help each other because each has something to offer the other that the other doesn't have. So they need each other, and they form this real friendship. And I was quite taken by that friendship. And so her role in the novel is to offer friendship and sustenance to Keita Ali, and also to sort of kick ass in society as this older woman. And she's in a lot of trouble. And so her troubles intersect with his. And
what about the scam she's running in the library?
She goes out. Well, I so love libraries. I've spent my life in libraries. When I first thought that my obligation in entering a library, I was kind of terrified. I was about 6, and my dad took me into the library, and I thought that it meant I had to read all the books. And I said, how am I going to read all these books? It was a big library, the Don Mills Public Library, on Don Mills Road near Lawrence Avenue near Don Mills Road. And I just was so overwhelmed by that library and all the books I thought I was going to have to read, including the whole set of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And so I just fell in love with libraries and went there all the time, and always would sign out books, and I still remember my favorites. And so Ivernia is in trouble, and she's gotten into a lot of trouble, and she's got to get her way out of trouble. And one of the ways she has to get her way out of trouble in this book is to do volunteer service to prove that she's still capable to live autonomously. And that she's not going to be robbed of her autonomy by the state. And so she works as a volunteer in a library, and she gives out bogus library cards to undocumented refugees who can't get library cards because they don't have any documentation. She just gives them out anyway. And so she's running this scam in the library where she's giving out bogus cards to anybody who comes up to her. So that's a little bit about Ivernia Beach.
And what I love about her is that she knows in a lot of ways she's invisible, and so that's why she can run this scam, which is so fantastic.
She's 85 and nobody's paying attention to her. Nobody thinks she'd pull off some illegal thing like that, so she just does it.
She just does it. Okay, so we're just going to transition out of this section. So I'm going to read this, and I wanted to end this section because I feel like this is something that we have all heard before. So the book was published in 2015, and you had been writing this so long beforehand. But here we go. So why do you think they keep coming here from all over the world, John asked. Because they have made it in Freedom State. Services, electricity, clean water, a booming economy. They have every opportunity to abuse our generosity. The children in Africtown attending substandard schools or no schools at all, and sleeping in garages and on the street. Are they abusing your generosity, John asked. Son, that's what you would call a bleeding heart question. You would have to talk to their parents. Why did they bring them here? Why are they working illegally in an underground economy, not paying taxes, and not registered as citizens of this country? But why would you fault a child for what their parents have done, John asked. I'm not faulting any children, but their parents have to take responsibility for their actions. So to me, this was before DACA. But when I read this twice, and when I read it again, it's actually, you can't see it, but it says DACA on the bottom. But before you respond, Baharak, our final segment of What Would Larry Say is this is an interview that you did 3 years ago. So
to need humanity and to find ways to make it work for refugees and for Canada.
This is a very bleak picture of the future, and the future that you describe here in the book is supposed to be 3 years in the future. It's not that far off. You think we're headed there?
I hope we're not. We could be. Let's be honest. There are political parties who are gaining increasing purchase, especially in Europe, who advocate openly hateful attitude towards refugees and immigrants.
The good news is they're not getting a big percentage of the vote.
Well, the Front National won 17% of the popular vote in France in the last presidential election. 17% is a lot of people in France voting for a party that has an openly hateful attitude towards refugees and immigrants. And so hopefully they're not going to win anywhere. In this novel, we've gone to the nightmare situation where a far right-wing party that's devoted to catching and deporting refugees wins power in a major parliamentary democracy. So I certainly hope we don't go there. I'm not saying we will, but in this novel, I'm imagining that we did.
I hear...
Okay, so
This is before Trump.
Yes. And so my question is, what would you, 2018, Larry, say to 2015, Larry, in light of what's happened since then?
I'd say good on you. I'm glad you made those arguments, and I'm proud that I raised those concerns in the book. I wrote the book because I was concerned about the emergence of hatred toward refugees, which is in a refusal to recognize the humanity of millions of people who, through no fault of their own, have lost their homes and houses and seen their relatives die and are on the move. And it's easy from a place of comfort in Canada to just refuse to see what's happening to millions of people, for example, who've had to flee Syria. Did they flee Syria for the fun of it? You know, our family has sponsored a family of Syrian refugees to Hamilton, Ontario, where we live. We're talking about torture. We're talking about the grave risk of death. We're talking about people who have reason to believe that they'll die if they don't get out of the country. So it's hard sometimes for Canadians to sort of own up to that. And I guess that's what I was getting at in the novel and in my interview with Steve.
Mm-hmm. It's so wild that the future is happening right now. Like it's 2018 right now. That book is taking place right now. And it just feels so appropriate to the like, I don't know about you, but I feel like that quote that I read, like I've heard that over and over and over again. And so for me, I feel like this is the illegal was a really good opportunity for me to be able to talk about contemporary political issues. And I'm not a political scientist. Sometimes I'm really intimidated to talk, even like during the refugee crisis. I didn't feel like I knew enough to be able to say anything. And I feel like the illegal was a place for me to be able to engage conversations with people through the literature.
I want to add that in that interview in 2015, I was worried about a result in the French national election in which the Front National had won 17% of the popular vote. Actually, in an election about 2 years after that interview, the Front National won way more than 17%. And that's Marine Le Pen. I can't remember what the numbers were, but it was more like 40 or 38% or some crazy high number. I'm sorry, I don't remember it exactly, but I know for a fact it was way higher than 17%. So the concerns were, unfortunately, were borne out.
Okay, thank you. All right, so our final segment, just as is just a brief look at emerging self and society. So Bahak, we're going to look at the three pieces. So in 2001, you wrote Blackberry Sweet Juice. And this is a memoir, but also an ethnographic study. And you share your experience growing up in Toronto with a white mother and a black father. And you've already talked about your parents and their background in terms of civil rights and moving to Canada. You document that in the next slide with this lovely piece. So we live in BC, so we might not have access to these. So I just wanted to end with a couple of pieces that your BC audience might not have seen
Sure,
before.
and you can see this online in BC too, if that's what you meant by access.
No, but that's what I mean. I accessed it, but I mean, someone in BC might not necessarily
Oh, I got it. Okay.
be looking at this. So I wanted to just end with here's some other amazing stuff that you write that's not fiction. So you created this archival site about your dad. And my favorite part is when you click on the link under the children, there's this beautiful, there's the book, Blackberry Sweet Juice. There's music by Dan and a poem by your sister. And so it's interesting to me how the archives kind of become a family album, which I'm not crying tonight, but I mean, there are just some really, really beautiful moments. So there's this, and then this is the piece that I would like you to speak to, is a piece you did in the Star just a few weeks after your sister Karen Hill died in 2014, and it really documents her struggle with mental illness. You talk about your family. And if you go to this link, there's so many beautiful images. And again, it's like the newspaper becomes a family album. And so,
by the way, I was a student at UBC in that picture. That was just after my first year at UBC, so that's 1975. And so I was about 18, and this is Karen, who's 17 in that picture. And Dan is, I guess he's about 20 in that picture. And that's my dad and mom. Yeah.
Right. And then our next slide is you had Karen's book published posthumously. And so I just wanted to end with just you talking about you putting your personal life in these very public spaces and sharing so much of yourself. So I'm wondering why you do that, and if there are any topics that you feel that you can't talk about.
Well, sure, but the topics I don't feel I can't talk about, I won't be talking about tonight. But for sure, we all have our lines in the sand, absolutely. Like, say if you're writing a memoir, and let's be honest, you can't write a memoir that's authentic without pissing off somebody. Who wants to see themselves written about in a memoir? And so I'm sure if my own children, one of my own 5 kids said, Dad, I'm writing a memoir about you, I wouldn't be so comfortable. Who wants to be exposed, by their own child or spouse or whatever? So memoir writing is fraught and risky, and if you're being honest, and what's the point of writing a memoir if you're not honest? Like, really, just don't do it if you can't be honest. People will be hurt, some people, and angry, and we all have to draw our own lines in the sand. I'm going this far, but I'm not going to talk about this. I just can't go there. So we all make those decisions. Karen, and actually we were chatting over a snack before going on stage tonight, Chantal and and I'm actually quite a private person in my regular life, and I need to feel real confidence in a person before I'll open up. I'm quite a restrained and private person in my private life, but when I write, it's just me alone, so I'm not really thinking about all the people who are going to read what I've just confessed to. I'm just playing with words and playing with my creativity and working, so it's a private exercise, although it's going to become public when it's published. And so it's easier to write about it than it is to talk about it in public, in a way, because you're just there in the silence of your own room working. You're just playing inside your own head. You don't have to confront the ugly business of talking about it in public and how painful that might be, sometimes. Mm-hmm. It's not always painful. Often it's joyous and beautiful, but sometimes it's really hard. So I am actually, I know it sounds contradictory or maybe hard to believe, but I am a very private person. But so I need a lot of confidence in a person before I can open up. But I write openly, and so I guess that's a bit of a contradiction, but that's who I am.
You're a contradiction. That's all right. I just found that the article
About Karen?
About Karen was particular, for me, it was particularly moving because, I have people in my life who suffer from mental illness, and there was a part of that story that I could relate to. And but I just thought about the humanizing factor and the way you talk about your sister, and it just made me, there's so much right now around addressing mental illness and people not having to hide and be ashamed, and I just feel like that piece was elegant, but I think it probably touched a lot of people.
I hope so. I mean, like many people, I'm sure in this audience, I've dealt with a lot of mental illness in my family. It kind of runs through many people in my family. I'm very fortunate not to have been beset by that particular medical problem, but it's not a credit to me or anything. I got lucky, and that particular problem didn't hit me as it has hit many people in my family. And Karen had a really interesting and rich life, but unfortunately, when she was in her mid-20s, she was struck down by a hideous bout of mental illness that had her hospitalized for months in Berlin, where she was living at the time, West Berlin. And I went to help her and to get her into the hospital that first time, and we were very close. We always have been, and she worked on this novel for some 20 years. And I mean, it's hard to write. Anybody in this room who's writing fiction, for example, knows how hard it is. But to write a novel when you live with bipolar disorder is kind of like swimming upstream. And she might have, 6 months out of a year when she was functional, her mind was working enough to sit down and write. And the other 6 months, she was fried, or in the hospital, or getting into one, or getting out of one, or totally addled with too many drugs that just made it impossible for her to have clarity of mind. So the antipsychotic drugs they're not exactly helpful for the creative spirit, but they might keep you out of the hospital again, maybe. And so Karen had to juggle with this. It took her 20 years to write that novel in between bouts of intense illness. And I have such great admiration for that. And she died while she was trying to publish it. So she'd finished it, but it hadn't had the benefit of being edited or anything like that yet. So it was circulating to publishers when she died in an accident. And so I just carried on the struggle to get it published after, which it was. And I wrote the foreword to the book, and it's a beautiful book, a very autobiographical novel. And at the end of the book, there's this beautiful essay that she wrote. I've read a lot about mental illness, and I've read a lot of first-person accounts of mental illness, but I've actually not read a better first-person account than my sister's. I even think hers is better than William Styron's account, which was really good. William Styron, the author of Sophie's Choice and the Nat Turner Confessions. And she writes this essay called On Being Crazy in the back of the book, which I persuaded the publisher, HarperCollins, to include in the back of the book. So even if you don't turn straight to the novel, her essay is really quite a genius. And it's playful, and it's funny, it's raw, and it's real, about what it's like to live with bipolar disorder and to try to be a writer. Yeah, so it's at the back of Cafe Babanosa, and that's Karen and me sitting in my grandmother's house in Washington, D.C. in 1984. I was a reporter for the Winnipeg Free Press, and I had 2 weeks vacation, so I went with my sister to see our grandmother May in D.C. This is a, educated, social worker, black grandmother who was horrified by Porgy and Bess because it showed black people cavorting around, doing things like having sex outside marriage. And this grandmother was just so horrified by Porgy and Bess that she just couldn't speak about it. She was so upset because it showed black people in a bad light. And so she didn't like that musical. But I adored May, and so I went to visit her with my sister, and here we are in my grandmother's house in D.C. in 1984.
Thank you. Okay, our last slide.
Yeah.
So we started with a baby picture, and now this is a very recent picture when you were in the Yukon. So before we go, can you tell us what you're working on and what we have to look forward to?
Sure, yeah, I just spent the whole winter in Dawson City researching and writing this new novel and called The Midnight Men. And it's a novel about the 5,000 African-American soldiers who were brought up from Georgia and Louisiana and South Carolina to build the Alaska Highway in northern BC and Yukon in 1942. The coldest winter on record. They were segregated racially. They were sent up to Yukon and northern BC in rubber boots in the winter. Some of them froze to death. Thankfully, not very many. But they built the Alaska Highway, which is a 3,000-kilometer highway from Dawson Creek, BC, up through Fort St. John, Fort Nelson, Watson Lake, passing through Whitehorse, Haines Junction, and then into Alaska. And it was built in 1942 by the American Army through Canada in order to anticipate the Japanese invasion of Alaska. And then the Japanese thought that they would invade Alaska and then come down the North American coast after taking Alaska, which was closest to Japan in the war and the most weakly defended part of America. And so there was this palpable paranoia that the Japanese would attack Alaska. So that's why the highway was built. And about half the 10,000 soldiers who built it were African Americans from the Deep South. So I'm writing a novel about a black engineer from Cumberland Island, Georgia, who's up in Haines Junction, Yukon, building the Alaska Highway in 1942.
Awesome. Thank you. So I would like to say thank you to all of you. I know we started late and we ended a bit late. And I would really like to thank you for your generous spirit and your knowledge and your intelligence and your kindness and your kitten letters and just for sharing so much with us. So
thank you. And I haven't read those kitten letters since I wrote them. So it was really something. I read them for the first time about 3-4 weeks ago when Chantal and I were talking about what we do tonight. And I haven't read them since I wrote them. So it was really something to come across them again. So thank you for bringing me back to my own childhood.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
I would like also to add my thanks. What a wonderful lecture. I couldn't ask for a better lecture. It was perfect. When I introduced this evening's event, I said that we wanted to talk a little bit about the role of libraries and archives. Thank you for doing that. Talk about sparking creativity, fueling scholarship and art, and acting as a catalyst for a more just society And you did all of that and more. Thank you. You touched on the way that books, especially good books, the ones that change our lives, make us very uncomfortable. And yet, I loved the phrase when you were talking about the Book of Negroes and you said you placed a reassuring hand on the reader. And I feel tonight in guiding us through some of these really important topics that, again, you had that reassuring hand on us. Thank you. And Chantal, thank you for all the time and energy and thought and love you put into this. Wonderful. I'll remind you that we have books for sale from Pulp Fiction Books out in the lobby, and that Lawrence Hill will be available to sign books for those who would like. And I want also to, again, thank the Takor family and the gift from the Takor Charitable Foundation who made this evening possible. And I want to give my heartfelt thanks to Baharak Yosefi, who organized the event and looked after every detail, large and small, and also to the library staff and student volunteers who have helped us out this evening. Thank you very much.